Because what we want to do in early intervention is to avoid the Bergson bias. Most people understand personality disorder from their interactions with the patients in the emergency room that we call frequent flyers. Those patients represent only a subset of those with BPD. They're the ones that don't respond to treatment. So these are the patients that are more chronic and treatment resistant and likely to stay in treatment, whereas most patients will get the care they need and leave. You don't see those as often. So what we want to do is we want to intervene before adolescents rise to the occasion of the Bergson bias and become those patients that have now represented or typify BPD to most clinicians. This idea is depicted in this cartoon of Calvin and Hobbes, that it really starts that engine of individuals learning that they have to make some sort of explosive statement to get other people to understand them. And that becomes reinforced over time when there's a failure to understand that someone has the problems of BPD. So do you remember when I was saying to you there is a myth that all teenagers are a bit borderline? That comes from a basic fact, that there's a normative rise of BPD symptoms around the age of 8 or 9, and it peaks at around 14 to 16, and then goes down. So the period of adolescence is one of enormous changes in the brain and adaptation in the bridge between childhood and dependency towards adulthood and responsibility. It's an incredibly stressful, transformative, and busy time. And so what happens over this time is that kids are released into the world with no skills, and they are impulsive, emotional, and sensitive, and misdirected, make mistakes, and they learn from them. And this is when they develop a sense of self. And that sense of identity then starts to kind of adjust and modulate all of their emotions and their behaviors and their interactions with others so that these BPD symptoms get contained. And that happens concomitantly with myelination and changes in the brain, so that there's more connectivity between the different parts of the brain, so that the functions of their cognition become better orchestrated. But as I explained to you, there will be a subset of people who have traits that are elevated. And we understand from studying people across time that for these individuals, they'll stay elevated for the most part. And the problem here is not just first the burden of having impulsivity, self-destructiveness, emotional reactivity, and interpersonal instability, if that's not enough of a problem. But then there's this problem that their distance from their peers become more aggravated, and they become outliers or outsiders to the world. And they don't have the capacity to learn coping skills and the things they need to acquire in order to become an adult. This is why we oftentimes call people with BPD primitive, immature, or underdeveloped. So the goal is that if we can intervene earlier and bring down the burden of these symptoms, that may also relieve the sense of alienation these folks feel from their peers and from society in general. Because if you're on the outside of society, you have to make a lot of noise in order to be heard. If you're on the outside of society, you don't want to live because you don't know if you'll survive. Belonging is an important buffer to the challenges of life. So many of my colleagues, like Andrew Chanin, Carla Sharp, and others, have really introduced this idea that we have to intervene earlier. If someone had diabetes, we'd intervene right away as soon as it's detected. If someone had cancer, you want to intervene when you can still isolate it so that its effects aren't more damaging or fatal. So there has been a lot of literature in the early 2000s about early intervention, which has been pretty controversial over time. But we now know from the growing scientific literature that BPD can be reliably diagnosed in early life. Many studies have been shown that the diagnosis of BPD is just as valid during adolescence as it is in later stages. And it's just as prevalent in clinical practice, as I've said to you. But this is where the functional disabilities for these individuals begin early, and it starts to make them feel broken beyond repair and like they can't do anything. And in the adolescent period, you have to be a little bit grandiose and self-confident to face life in and of itself. And so they lack that kind of impetus or motivation and self-confidence to take risks and make attempts at things that will fuel their sense of self and pave a path to the future. Furthermore, we know personality is malleable. You see teens, one week they'll kind of dress in a certain manner, and then maybe 6 months later they're a totally different version of themselves. So we want to take advantage of that period where it's normal to try to on different versions of yourself and transform. And we also know that this disorder responds to interventions. So how do we know this? I'm not going to go into detail, but there were